So let me give you a little bit of an introduction about the topic. I know I'm preaching to the choir, so please bear with me. The first few slides may seem fluffy and eye level, and you will feel you've already heard of this, but I wanted to give you the whole logic of why, according to the research that we're conducting with the rest of the consortium, data spaces can add a lot of value, right? So the first feeling that I have when I talk about smart cities and when I attend big conferences like the Smart City Expo, I was not there this year, but I've been 6 or 7 times, is that there's a lot of flashy solutions, right? And I'm a big believer after 15 years of working around within advising cities in Europe, Middle East, Asia, North America, that it's clear for everyone that solutionism is dead, right? Those flashy tech things on their own don't add value. There was an issue from the MIT Technology Review, I think 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, that made this statement that cities are more than 5G, big data, driverless vehicle, and AI. And I will talk about all of those things in my presentation, but cities are much more. That's the starting point, being aware that cities are about ambiguity and complexity and lives of people and diversity. And just to give you a practical example, right, when the Ukraine war started, fortunately, a couple of years ago, there was a big influx of refugees. And that was one stark example, but Europe as a whole is dealing with people coming from other regions. And one of the things that they need to be recognized, to find a job, to access health and education in the cities that are welcoming them, is to get a piece of identity of some sort, right? Being recognized that they exist, that they may have a temporary address, and so forth and so on. And one of the things that came about very clearly during the early stages of the Ukraine refugee crisis, but it is happening on a daily basis. I was discussing about that in Italy, where I live, with somebody that is focused on these topics, is simply asking those people to register on a website to get a piece of identity and access services across the city or from the regional government is not as intuitive as it could be for us, because they may be concerned that the data will be captured and used in a malicious way by the government, because they may come from geographies where the government is not as transparent, right? So a cultural mediator is necessary to fill that gap, to explain why providing some data to the government can be beneficial, right? So those ambiguity are very much about the reality and the texture of every different cities, every different context. So technology and data and AI need to be considered within that framework. And quite honestly, the look and feel of our cities is slightly different from 2000 years ago, but some of the realities of urban lives, or the value of the city as a physical environment and the city as cultural and community texture, where we live, where we thrive, or where we find ourselves vulnerable, is not very different. The meaning that we give is not very different, right? If you look at what was happening in Roman times, the concept of a 5-minute city was already there. Now we have the 15-minute city that we're trying to wrap our arms around again, right? So those meanings, very personal, very touching for every individual and community are still important. True, we have a different context, a different environment. We have some new challenges, but these new challenges, if at all possible, are putting cities even more at the center of the scene, right? The changes that we've experienced after the pandemic, the demographic pressures, variation across different geographies, but these are all realities in terms of climate change and resilience, in terms of the importance, the economic importance of cities and how they're affected by the volatility. I mentioned the results of and the impact of political volatility and so forth and so on. So cities are even more so and are expected to continue being at the center of the scene. Europe has its own specific context with few very large cities and a lot of metro areas or conurbations where rural areas are gravitating around medium-sized cities. But the city as an entity is really important in our region as well. What digital has done to the city context is it has brought new considerations. It has brought new opportunities, but it has also created new complexities, right? If you think of the opportunity brought about by the value of data in the context of traffic management, or in the context of identifying vulnerable people for social services, or connecting social services with healthcare providers in the city. A lot of new opportunities, but a lot of complexities as well, right? How do we protect, for example, the data that is being exchanged, not only from a regulatory compliance perspective, vis-a-vis, for example, GDPR, but also in terms of the ethical implication, the risks of bias that are coming about because of AI. How do we protect the resilience of this digital infrastructure, right? If systems like energy grids and traffic management systems, air quality monitoring systems, and I don't know, healthcare systems, medical devices in hospitals are more and more connected to our digital backbone, they have a direct impact on the operational resilience of the city, right? So they need to be protected. So a lot of opportunities, but a lot of complexities and some risks definitely that need to be taken into consideration in this new context. So keeping all of that in mind, eventually the question that we're asking ourselves is, what are the digital capabilities that can enhance our lives in cities, in communities? What are the capabilities that can drive better prosperity, better livability? So looking at network, cloud, AI, digital twin through the lenses of those ambiguities, of those outcomes that cities want to achieve in terms of cleaner air, waste collection, recycling, inclusion, safety of roads, and so forth and so on. And we call that the PPP model, right? If cities want to go beyond techno-solutionisms and look at interoperability, for example, only from the technical perspective, if they want to go beyond pilots and scale AI capabilities where it makes an impact, they always need to think through the lenses of how they can improve lives of people living in the city, people intended as residents, tourists, refugees we mentioned earlier, the place where they live, right? So the physical infrastructure and the performance, which means enabling the city administration, broadly intended as the city government, the nearby municipalities that may be part of a conurbation, the utilities, the transit authorities to perform well, to be responsive, to deliver trusted engagement with the citizens, and be able to deliver inclusive services and so forth and so on. Right. So at a high level, the outcomes along these three axes of people, place, and performance should be the guiding principle of any investments in technologies that cities are making or planning to make. And one of the things that we try to do at IDC is to look at practical use cases, right? Because if you only have that eye level, you don't get the detailed scenario where you want to make an impact. You don't necessarily understand what are the impacted users, what are the stakeholders that they need to contribute, what are the KPIs that it makes sense to track, right? So it's only at the deeper level of use cases, right? I was talking the other day with somebody that is developing solutions around text analytics, right? For either controlling misinformation, fighting hate speech. And the other use case they gave me was fighting against child abuse, right? So working with police forces at the city level, at the regional or national level, depending on how police is organized in the various countries, and try to identify based on language patterns, both in a preventive manner and in forensic investigation use cases, how looking at data through advanced text analytics and AI algorithms can help identify those risks. Or I talked about vulnerable people earlier. The city of Milan, for example, is looking at how to bring together data about kids with disabilities, right? And offer a more end-to-end journey for parents and families that have to support them through school and social services and health services and so forth and so on, right? So linking it to those high-level missions, but then diving deeper into the roadmap of use cases that matter, like the pilots in our projects are doing, for example, around traffic management, road work, planning and safety, and air quality monitoring, and so forth and so on. And all of this is now magnified and amplified in terms of potential, but also in terms of complexity, right? In what we call the AI everywhere era. We're not saying we have general artificial intelligence or that we'll have that anytime soon, but we're definitely saying and seeing that AI is making an impact on a larger and larger number of use cases being embedded into systems and processes, from the more mundane things in the back end to the more flashy things that have to do with the city infrastructure, right? So we are considering how AI and Gen AI will drive impact across some of those use cases that I presented to you in an earlier map. And I'll give you a couple of examples again to be very practical, right? So AI, not Gen AI, but AI applied to traffic safety, going down to the granular level of identifying areas of the city at risk of, or intersections of the city at risk of near misses or with higher risk of near misses, right? Identifying intersections where, for example, because of the type of turns, the type of traffic, heavy traffic, coming into the same place with pedestrians and cyclists crossing bike lanes, could generate higher risk of accidents that may have not happened yet, but there are patterns and conditions that are evolving and creating those sorts of risks, and AI can be applied in that case. Or Gen AI applied to permitting and licensing, for instance, right? Was talking with somebody in Spain that was dealing with both at the regional and local level with some of the environmental permitting. If you want to put solar panel on your roof, you have to attach a big set of documents to the application that you submit to the regional or the city government. And of course, the experts in the government that have to review all of those documents take a lot of time, right? Which has an impact on the type of loans and subsidies and credits that citizens or businesses and construction companies can benefit from. It has an impact on the pace of the work. It has an impact on those that have applied for a mortgage from the bank to finance some of the works and so forth and so on. So they were piloting the applicability of generative AI to sort through those documents, to provide a summary, to flag areas where the expert caseworker had to spend more time to enable that type of sustainable building, permitting, and planning, and so forth and so on. Right. So a variety of areas where AI and Gen AI is being experimented with, and being cognizant of the fact that it's about the journey, right? It's not about identifying a single task and solving one tiny problem, but using that across all of those city domains, from civic engagement to sustainable planning to public health and so forth and so on, identifying a journey where one step nurtures the next step in terms of having areas where AI is already tested and it can be scaled, having areas where AI can be experimented with, and having areas that inspire future investments, right? All the while taking into considerations some of the governance issues, the guardrails that need to be put in place to realize the benefits of these capabilities at scale. And don't get me wrong, it's not only about AI, right? There are a number of other capabilities that can come together, right? Like immersive experience capabilities, somebody calls them spatial computing, that create 3D experiences for inspectors, for instance, that have to look at a certain building, or for those that are planning the city. Digital twins that combine AI and immersive visual experience. Emergency management, right? So this combination of AI with other set of capabilities is definitely one area of investment that many cities are looking at, including many of those that are participating to these projects. And I'll give you just a practical example, again, because I want to go from the eye level to more of the use cases, right? So when we talk to cities, we try to look in depth at how, for example, digital twins can add value in what we call transportation hubs, right? Train stations, airports, ports, bus stations. And there's plenty of different areas, from the customer or passenger experience to the operation efficiency to energy management, where digital twin can add value, right? So it's only by identifying the outcomes, setting the KPIs at this level, that we can fight the techno solutionism and deal with the ambiguity and the specificity of the context, right? So just to give you a sense in terms of maintenance, traffic flow in a port, right? Managing and deciding how much traffic of incoming and outgoing trucks in a city port is bearable for the neighborhoods and for the road infrastructure, for the air quality, whether the port wants to charge for the pollution that those trucks cause in the area in partnership with the city and so forth and so on. Right? So a lot of different areas at the granular level where the impacts need to be realized. And of course, it's not all gold that glitters, as we say, right? There's a lot of opportunities. There's a lot of attention. There's a lot of appetite, according to our analysis and predictions, to pilot generative AI, to do multiple pilots at the same time. But what is the next stage? What is the innovation process to make sure that from those pilots, cities and communities can identify the meaningful areas where to make that impact? And I was talking to a government entity. This was a national level, but just to give you a sense, they told me they started over a year ago, right? So a few months after ChatGPT came about, they started with 150 ideas for Gen AI pilots throughout their agency, and the potential of using 130 different tools and algorithms to experiment with those 150 use cases. And they're now down to 10 ideas that they want to scale and implement, right? So it's very much about making sure that those pilots translate into something while taking into account the risks, right? I was having a conversation with utility in the Czech Republic, right? And they were looking at quite common use cases. They were looking at how they could use drone imaging and apply computer vision algorithms to do predictive maintenance on grids in terms of identifying risks coming from vegetation, risks coming from birds' nests that could catch fire, and so forth and so on. And now they have the usual costly process of flying an helicopter every 3 months, every 4 months. And drones could be a cheaper option, but they need to have the ability to use the appropriate algorithms. And one of the key considerations was among two algorithms that we're testing, right? It's important to see not only or select the one that is the most accurate, but it's also important to select the one that is the most explainable and transparent, right? Because we have to be able to comply with regulation like NIS2, for instance, since the utilities are critical infrastructure providers. We need to be able to identify the root causes of certain patterns that we detect. So that governance aspect, the cybersecurity, the bias, the ethical consideration to make sure that the AI innovation is also responsible innovation is important. Otherwise, the risk is to suffer attacks or suffer major setbacks in terms of public trust in how AI is used in a technical solutionist manner, if you will. And why did we discuss about all of this in the context of data spaces? Because AI and digital twin and immersive experience capabilities and big data and analytics don't exist without well-curated data and well-governed data, right? So your Amsterdam, Helsinki, Rotterdam, Eindhoven registers for AI transparency, curating the data quality, the data lineage, but also, and this is across industries, not just in cities and government, 45% of executives that we've interviewed in Western Europe think that implementing data sharing and operations practices that ensure data integrity for large language model developed internally in conjunction with third party is the most important policy to put in place to ensure the success of Gen AI, right? Data sharing as the foundation to scale the benefits of this technology in a meaningful manner. There was an interesting study that came out a couple of months ago from MIT in collaboration with somebody else. I don't remember who, but it was quite interesting. And it talked about the risk of data poverty, right? Data poverty, as in the more we use AI, the more we have new algorithms to train, the more we connect algorithms in multi-agents, catalogs, and orchestrations and workflows, the more the new AI algorithms that are coming to bear and to fruition run the risk of being trained on low quality data sets or too small of a data set with a bias, right? So sharing data with all of the protections, with all of the guardrails, it is the foundation to avoid the risk of data poverty and really monetize the value of data in a meaningful manner. And monetize, I'm not using the term as in selling the data for revenues, for a fee, for a subscription necessarily, but really making a difference in the context of the differences, the ambiguity, the local context of every city, right? And that is essential because cities and governments overall and public sector institutions overall are trying to do many different things with AI and Gen AI. For some of the use cases, they're happy with the commercial systems, but those are mostly what we would call productivity use cases, right? Individual productivity, summarization of some meeting notes, but then you also have risks around the protection of the information, the sensitivity, and so forth and so on. Many are fine-tuning, building guardrails around those fine-tuning environment. Others are creating their own small language models that are orchestrated and connected with large language model as the entry point in a multi-agent orchestration environment, as I mentioned earlier. Many have the necessity, and definitely in the city environment where there's a lot of physical infrastructure, to enable some of these algorithms to run at the edge. So the ability to move data, to provide access to data, even without persisting those data in all of these points, but enabling a federated access to data is essential. And that requires technical capabilities, but most importantly, it requires what we would call a journey throughout the maturity of the organization, right? Climbing the ladder of organizational maturity, thinking of what is the financially sustainable business model for data sharing? What is the governance model for accessing the data when there are external stakeholders? What are the minimal data set that are necessary for a certain use case without compromising personal data protection or intellectual property, and so forth and so on. And that's part of the thinking that should be embedded in your pilots, in your data cooperation canvases, of course, and so forth and so on. And quite frankly, it may not be your case, but when we look at governments and city government and national governments across the globe, the level of readiness to have the data protected, to have the right data lineage and logistics and control planes in place, to have the right metadata, making sure that the algorithms consume a certain data set or do not consume other data sets that remain protected is very much sparse in terms of maturity and requires a lot more effort. There are certain ecosystems where the sharing of data is a little bit easier because there's an anchor, right? So in the context of a city, if you think of a building or a new neighborhood that is being created as a greenfield or as a brownfield, or a transportation hub that we mentioned earlier, or a stadium, an arena, an area where events are happening, or in the case of small islands, for instance, there are more contained environments where data sharing is a little bit easier, right? There are more focused use cases that are easy to identify. There is a smaller number of stakeholders to put around the table and ensure the right governance is in place for them to share data. But these are limited. In the broader context of cities, and in the broader context of cities collaborating with other stakeholders like car OEMs for traffic management and smart mobility, collaborating with utilities for smart energy use, it's much more complicated. And this is where the strategy for data spaces can really add value, right? Data spaces should be seen in their federated model, both from a technical and governance perspective, and even more importantly, as the connective tissue that can make data sharing sustainable over time and translate data into information, into insights, into driving an impact on people, places, and performance for the city, right? So they are a key element in this value chain that can make a difference. So we are setting, or you are setting the foundation for the future where it's not about the technology anymore, but it's about the insights that can drive impact. Because quite frankly, right now, if we look at to what extent data sharing is happening, and the chart on the left here is across industries with over 1,000 respondents across the globe, but including governments, and the situation is now very different for government. Data sharing is happening to a very limited extent, right? It's happening when there's a need to comply with a certain regulation, wherein there is a temporary benefit. And in many cases, the data sharing is also complex because being ad hoc, temporary, one-off, it's mostly managed through bilateral agreements, contracts, memorandum of understandings, instead of having a governance that is embedded in some technical capabilities in a transparent manner, in an auditable manner, that facilitates that data exchange across multiple parties instead of a bilateral exchange that is prone to errors, that does not have clear responsibilities for keeping the data updated, that is not clear in terms of who's responsible for compliance and protection, and so forth and so on, right? So there's tons of reasons why data sharing is happening to a limited extent, and there's the equivalent value in the concept of data spaces being the most forward-looking concept in my experience across the globe in terms of federated data sharing in line with regulatory, ethical governance guardrails that we think are appropriate in the European context, right? When I talk to other entities in the Middle East, for instance, I was talking to a national government entity in a Gulf country recently, and their solution was, yeah, we create a national data lake. Everybody gives us their data from public sector and in the future private sector, and our single entity in a centralized manner will do the governance, will keep the data archived, and will then provide services and insights to the others. And I mean, even considering the different type of policy and governance at the high level that those countries have in place, the more top-down authorities that are governing those countries. It's difficult to think that such a model would work, and most importantly, that it would withstand the test of time, right? Because in a centralized model, you create the rigidity of also giving responsibility to that entity to keep pace
We are now
with the
approaching
innovation,
Liscott.
right? So the data spaces as an opportunity to move forward
Belongings with
in
you.
its journey. And of course, there's a set of capabilities that needs to be considered in the context of data spaces.
And take care when stepping down from the train.
Oh, you could go on mute. I hear noise in the background. Sorry. There are capabilities from the business capability perspective, the legal capabilities perspective, the operational capabilities perspective, functional, technical capabilities that need to be considered for all of the entities involved in the data space, for the operator, for the technology enablers, for the data providers, the data users. I had long conversations last year with the Spanish government and the Spanish chief data officer around this chart, and they did a great piece of work. They published their own view on how data spaces can evolve and what value-added capabilities they can bring to the table. But possibly more important that the capabilities in terms of interoperability and adherence, for instance, to MIMS interoperability standards, is conceptualizing the value of data spaces in the context of the federation, right? So first of all, data spaces for smart and sustainable cities and communities are inherently a federation. They are a data space of a data space, right? They branch out across all of the other data spaces that will exist or could exist in each city, region, country, and then federated at a European level. Admittedly, some of these are more pertinent in the context of city, like Green Deal, mobility, health, public administration, cultural heritage, and tourism, but others can have an impact as well, right? So thinking of how the work that you're doing in the pilot is not limited to traffic or road work planning and safety or air quality, but how it relates to tourism, for instance, from a traffic perspective, how it relates to health from an air quality perspective, and what are the possibilities not only of sharing data, but also sharing the technical artifacts, some of the capabilities that we discussed earlier, to drive value also in these other domains across the city. And then the other element that I don't have on the slide, but I think it's equally important, thinking of federation in terms of the other institutional level that will be involved, right? If you're creating a city data space in traffic management, how does that relate to the national traffic hubs that already need to exist according to the European regulation around providing centralized traffic information hubs? How do they relate to initiatives around data sharing with regional governments? how do they come together with the overall federation? And again, it's not just a technical question, right? It's a matter of building the solutions that you're looking at and experimenting also through the lenses of governance, through the lenses of financial sustainability, right? I was having a conversation for another EU project recently, and we were talking about a distributed ledger solution that is being developed, piloted, and experimented as part of a research and innovation program. And I asked the question, okay, what is going to happen after the the research project ends, right? What is the business model for ensuring delivering the distributed ledger services in the long term? And they did not really have an answer or a full answer. And the risk of that project falling into the so-called valley of death, because they did not think of how it could come to fruition and be consumable over time, not just within the project or within the entity they were experimenting the technology with, but in the broader context, in our case, in the broader context of data spaces across Europe. And after all of those theoretical discussions and some examples that I've given you, I wanted to bring it back to reality, to show, I know you know it already, but show it once more that what you're doing is really valuable, that there's a lot of work that has happened in cities across Europe, from traffic management in Verona to the city operations center in Cascais, that have delivered value because they had aggregated data, they had shared data, they had put the guardrail in place, they had created the collaborative model also for the experts to work together across the different entities and departments of the cities and with the partners at the other institutional level. In the case of Verona, traffic management is split, as in many other cities, between the traffic and transportation planning department, right? Those that do all of the master planning, the evaluation of new routes and new roads and new bike lanes and how to manage intersections, and the local traffic police, right? And they had created a collaborative model, even a physical collaborative model, meaning at some point they decided to bring the two offices in the same building, in the same floor, to make sure that they could share information, they could share good practices, they could share artifacts around computer vision, for instance. It doesn't mean the transportation planning department has access to all of the number plate recognition capabilities and the details about individuals and the traffic fines they get that the traffic police has. But it means they have access to some of the metadata. They can share information and insights on the patterns that they're seeing, right? So again, that part of the organizational maturity, the climbing the ladder of organizational maturity in the city from the governance, from the financial sustainability perspective, has been essential in that case as well. So let me conclude, right, with a few brief recommendations, just summarizing what I've told you. It's all about the purpose, right? You know it already, but I want to make sure I remark that it's about the people, the place, the performance, and the practical use cases underneath those visionary goals that you have. It's not about the technology. AI is getting a lot of attention right now, and I spoke a lot about AI in my presentation, but it's not a silver bullet. It's not even necessary to use AI in every application. right? Some traditional visual analytics can be as useful, or some interpretative analytics can be as useful as AI, and it could also consume less energy and less computing capacity in your data center or in the cloud services that you're using. The bigger purpose, of course, should not take away the attention from the opportunity of being efficient in what you're doing. Right? Do not reinvent the wheel. There is a lot of work that has been done in cities, in your cities, but also in EU projects. And unfortunately, some of that work fell down the valley of death of being forgotten. But there's also a lot of available material from other projects around location-based data and technology, about open data, reuse all of those capabilities rather than reinventing the wheel. When you build your solution, when you develop, design, and pilot your solution, always keep different deployment options in mind, right? We live in a world of hybrid infrastructure in terms of digital infrastructure, multi-cloud, on-premise, private cloud, sovereign cloud, right? Keeping the flexibility, decoupling the layers, essentially, of your architecture will help with that. I spoke a lot about governance, risk, and compliance, and I know in the pilots there are some of the cities that are leading the way when it comes to AI transparency, for instance, so I'm not going to insist on that. Data on the bottom right? Invest in data quality, data lineage, metadata. Actually, a lot of the AI investments that I'm seeing in government are to augment and improve in those areas of data integrity, data processing, data interpretation, well before creating analytical products based on AI, right? It's about enriching the tagging of data. It's about creating and maintaining the data sets that then can deliver the insights. And last but not least, the ecosystem collaboration, right? I had that slide. I spent a few minutes on that slide in terms of thinking of what you're doing through the lenses of federating with other city domains and federating with other institutional levels and other stakeholders in the cities and communities ecosystem. That is the most difficult part. It's always been, at least in my 20 years in public sector and 15 years talking and studying and advising smart cities, but it's also the one that helps ensure the long-term sustainability and the benefits realization for a broader number of stakeholders of what you're doing here. All right, that's all for me. I hope you found it useful, maybe a bit fluffy at the beginning, but I wanted to add the whole narrative to explain why we think the work that you're doing really matters in the bigger context of cities trying to use technology for a purpose. Thank you. And I think we have a few minutes for questions. If anybody has questions, or I'm happy, of course, to answer as a follow-up.